So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Dick Hebdige's book, Subculture. We have already started with this book. We have had one lecture and we talked about the importance of this particular book, especially for the purpose of this course. And we've seen already how Hebdige talks about two different narratives of culture. One, the Arnoldian narrative, which looks at culture as nostalgic, conservative, aesthetic category, something which must be recovered, so which looks at the past. It's a sort of backward-looking narrative which wants to retrieve all that was best and all that was beautiful, all that was harmonious in the world. And it looks at culture as a harmonious product, a product of civilization, a product of aesthetics, etc. And there's also a more socialist way of looking at culture, which is what Raymond Williams formulates quite clearly, and that's sort of forward-looking, more anthropological, more topical, more historical way of looking at culture, which tends to historicize everything, and which is sort of anti-classical to a certain extent, because the entire idea of making something classical is to invest a certain degree of timelessness to it, whereas the Williams category of culture is very temporal. It looks at trends, for instance. It looks at different micro-categories which are important for understanding of culture as a narrative as well as a structure, and it engages in a structuralist way of looking at culture as different kinds of structural activities which are connected to bigger structural activities. Now, at this point in the lecture, Hebdige talks about how cultural studies came into being as a discipline in humanities, and how that kind of a discipline was born, how it emerged, and how it came into being to different kinds of other kinds of disciplinary investments, from structuralism, for instance, from psychology, for instance, etc. So this is a point which we will start off in this lecture. In the early years, when it was being established in the universities, cultural studies sat rather uncomfortably on the fence between these two conflicting definitions: culture as a standard of excellence, culture as a whole way of life, unable to determine which represented the most fruitful line of inquiry. So obviously the two narratives, the two definitions laid out away, culture as a standard of excellence is the Arnoldian narrative of culture, and culture is a whole way of life, which talks about the ordinariness of culture, the topicality of culture. That's the more Raymond Williams way of looking at culture. And what Hebdige says over here is interesting. He says that when culture studies came into being, when it was first introduced in academia, it was somehow stuck between these two categories. It was confused between these two categories and didn't quite know how to negotiate between these two categories of looking at culture. Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams, very important figures, both of them. Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams portrayed working class culture sympathetically in wistful accounts of pre-scholarship boyhoods, Leeds for Hoggart and Welsh mining village for Williams. So we've already seen in the case of Raymond Williams how he comes from a very modest Welsh mining background, and how language becomes a very important issue for him, and culture. The war becomes a very important issue, because the war is not just, for Raymond Williams, the war is not just the First World War or the Second World War. These phenomena are not just acts of destruction, these are also acts of change, linguistic change. When it came back from the war, I mean, this is an episode which you have already studied, Williams quite clearly defines how language changes after the war. When they come back to the university, everything changes. Okay, so, but their work displayed a strong bias towards literature and literacy, and an equally strong moral one. So literature, literacy, morality does become very important biases for both Hoggart and Raymond Williams in their understanding of culture. Hoggart deplored the way in which the traditional working class community, a community of tried and tested values, despite the dull landscape in which it had been set, was being undermined and replaced by a candy-floss world of trills and cheap fiction, which is somehow bland and sleazy. So again, there is certain hierarchical quality about culture, and that Hoggart's understanding includes. So Hoggart is obviously more in favor of high culture, more in favor of moral culture, the morality of the working class community, the tradition of the working class community, how that tradition is being undermined and replaced by a cheap consumer's world of thrills and cheap pleasures and sleazy fictions, which are low in hierarchy, low in a cultural scale compared to the traditions and the conservative qualities of the working class community. This is the Hoggett way of looking at culture. Williams tentatively endorsed the new mass communications, but was concerned to establish aesthetic and moral criteria for distinguishing the worthwhile products from the trash. So Williams was seemingly more liberal. He was seemingly more inclusive, more welcoming. So new mass communications such as new modes of music, television, cinema. Cinema was obviously there already, but different kinds of mass communications came into being. And Williams was a bit guarded in terms of his acceptance of these mass communications. So he had a sort of criteria for excellence, criteria for high culture, good culture compared to trash. Right, so jazz, a real musical form, and the football, a wonderful game from the rape novel, the Sunday strip paper, and the latest in the 10-pound room. So the distinctions are quite clear. In Williams's case, jazz for him is real music, football is a wonderful game, and compared to that, the rape novel, the Sunday strip paper, and the latest 10-pound rule, this become trash. So there's a trash quality, there's a high quality of a culture that Williams retains in his socialist understanding of culture. In 1966, Hoggett laid down the basic premises upon which cultural studies were based. And this is a quotation from Hoggett that Hebdige is offering us here. First, without appreciating good literature, no one will really understand the nature of society. Second, literary critical analysis can be applied to certain social phenomena other than academically respectable literature, for example, the popular arts, mass communication, so as to illuminate their meanings for individual and their societies. So both Williams and Hoggett, they relied on literature quite a bit. So literacy, literature, literary studies, this became very important for them. And they looked at literature as very faithful and authentic and complex reflections of culture, and also as repositories of knowledge that one can draw on while formulating new cultural devices like mass music, mass entertainment, etc. The implicit assumption is that it still required a literary sensibility to read society with the requisite subtlety, and that the two ideas of culture could be ultimately reconciled was also paradoxically to inform the early works of the French writer Roland Barthes, though here it found validation in a method, semiotics, a way of reading science. So literature was seen as a privileged tool, a privileged instrument of study, a privileged instrument of examination, a very potent instrument of examination, that if one could acquire literary skills, if one could acquire literary reading skills, then obviously that would entail a better hermeneutic understanding of culture and cultural phenomena. And that kind of an instrumentality of understanding, that kind of a tool-based understanding device was something that Roland Barthes also incorporated. For Roland Barthes, obviously, rather than literature, it was semiotics, a study of science, which was more important in terms of looking at culture and examining culture as a phenomenon. So Barthes becomes also a very important figure in cultural studies as understood by Hebdige. And again, we began to look how cultural studies as a discipline draws on so many other disciplines such as mythology, mythological studies, semiotics, structuralism, psychology, political science, literature, literary studies, etc. All these things come to being so carefully and so complexly in any study of culture, and culture studies from the very inception was very quick to incorporate all these different other disciplines and sub-disciplines. Using models derived from the work of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, Barthes sought to expose the arbitrary nature of cultural phenomena to uncover the latent meanings of an everyday life, which to all intents and purposes was perfectly natural. Right, so Barthes was more important in terms of looking at the arbitrariness, the seemingly arbitrariness of everyday life, cultural phenomena, and to look for hidden depths, hidden structures, deeper structures, to uncover the deeper structures which inform this arbitrary phenomena of culture, which naturalize culture and cultural activities. Unlike Hoggett, Barthes was not concerned with distinguishing the good from the bad in modern mass culture, but rather with showing how all the apparently spontaneous forms and rituals of contemporary bourgeois societies are subject to systematic distortion, liable at any moment to be dehistoricized, naturalized, converted into myth. So, Barthes was more concerned, unlike separating the good from the bad, Barthes was more concerned how every cultural activity could be dehistoricized, could be mythologized, become a myth, through different acts of distortion, the different acts of naturalization. Naturalization, distortion, dehistoricization, and this conversion into mythology, all these for Barthes were very important phenomena which need to be studied, which were rituals of contemporary bourgeois society, and it relied a lot on distortion as a cultural activity. So Barthes was more concerned, rather than looking at the difference between good culture and bad culture, high culture and trash, which is what Hogarth and Williams were more concerned with. Barthes was more concerned with distortion and dehistoricization in terms of semiotic changes, and that's something that he was trying to study in his early structuralist phase. And this is a quotation from Barthes that Hebdige is offering us here. The whole of France is steeped in this anonymous ideology. Our press, our films, our theatre, our pulp literature, our rituals, our justice, our diplomacy, our conversations, our remarks about the weather, a murder trial, a touching wedding, the cooking we dream of, the garments we wear, everything in everyday life is dependent on the representation which the bourgeois has and makes us have, the relations between men and the world. So the entire idea becomes a fantastic structure, right? This anonymous ideology. So this anonymous ideology is a fantastic structure, a structure of fantasy, which informs all the activities of culture and the everydayness of culture, which the bourgeois has and makes us have, of the relations between men and the world. So in a way, this will remind us of a text which we have already done, and that is Hannah Arendt's idea of action, action, activity, work, where the whole idea is a negotiation between men and other men, between men and culture, in the world in which they live in. So the whole of France, according to Barthes, obviously there's a hyperbolic quality about his definition, but what he's saying is this anonymous ideology, which is this grand narrative of culture, which is basically an act of imagining, is a fantastic imaginary which informs and is invested in the everyday activities of life, right? Representation, distortion, meaning making. So all these things, actions, different kinds of actions and rituals. So all these things are basically acts of structural investments, actual structural imaginary, which the bourgeois has and makes us have, of the relations between men and the world, right? So this becomes a grand narrative, an ideology, which we internalize all the time to different kinds of fantastic investments and fantastic consumptions. And I use word fantastic quite literally away, an act of fantasy, which is what informs this grand narrative of culture, according to Barthes. Like Eliot, Barthes' notion of culture extends beyond the library, the opera house, and the theatre to encompass the whole of everyday life, right? So it's not just limited, like Eliot, Barthes too doesn't limit himself or limit the study of culture inside the academic space, but it moves outside of it as well. And it moves outside the theatre, moves outside the opera house, and it encompasses the whole of everyday life, the wholeness, the daily discourses that inform everyday life. But this everyday life is for Barthes overlaid with a significance which is at once more insidious and more systematically organized. Starting from the premise that myth is a type of speech, Barthes set out in Mythology to examine the normally hidden set of rules, codes, and conventions which, through which meanings particular to specific social groups that those in power are rendered universal and given for the whole of society. So what Barthes does in this really important book called Mythology is he looks at the codes, the very coded system, the very coded quality through which meaning making happens. The very coded quality which constitute the hidden set of rules which are invested in making power and making hegemonic meanings and making dominant understanding of life and dominant understanding of culture, etc. So mythology has become a bit of an act of decoding. So it's like looking at the codes, looking at different mythical codes and local myths, which are obviously by mythologies. Barthes doesn't mean the ancient mythologies only. He talks about the mythologies of power, the fantasy of power, the way in which certain sections of people become more powerful, certain sections of society become more powerful, certain discourses become dominant. This dominance, this powerfulness, this power, this authority, so all these are mythologies. All these really have no logical sense, but they become consolidated through these mythical investments, right? Through these imaginary investments, through these coded investments, the codes and conventions in which meanings of particular specific social groups are rendered universal and given for the whole society. So how does a grand narrative come into being? So obviously every grand narrative is a mythology. Every grand narrative, according to Roland Barthes, is a mythological formation, because it just takes into certain codes and makes into some kind of a system which then becomes unquestionable. It becomes a given in a certain set of time. He found in phenomena as disparate as a wrestling match, a writer on holiday, a tourist guidebook, the same artificial nature, the same ideological core. So if you read Roland Barthes' Mythologies, which is a really interesting book for structuralism, you find that he talks about all kinds of random references. He talks about the wrestling matches, he talks about writers, he talks about tourist guidebooks, he talks about fish and chips, he talks about Balzac's novels. So you find what Barthes does. He looks at certain set of codes, certain set of structures which are running parallel, which are invested in each of these apparently disparate cultural activities, such as wrestling, frying fish and chips, going on holidays, writing tourist guidebooks, all these seemingly disparate categories of existence, of activities. They have certain structures, certain recurring structures, certain recurring codes that Barthes seeks to unpack and discover through this particular book. Okay, and it also has the same ideological core, the ideological core being that of a tendency towards hegemonization, a tendency towards becoming a grand narrative, so this tendency towards totalization, towards hegemonization. These become the same kind of, these run across the different kinds of cultural activities that Barthes examines in this particular book, Mythologies. Each had been exposed to the same prevailing rhetoric, the rhetoric of common sense, and turned into a myth, into a mere element in a second-order semiological system, right? So we will talk about common sense a little later as well, when we read Kathleen Belsey's book, Critical Practice, after this. But the point is, common sense becomes an ideology. The common sense becomes the imaginary ideology, which is invested in each of these categories. And what Barthes discovers quite interestingly is that each of these activities, like wrestling, going on holidays, writing tourist books, frying fish and chips, these are apparently disparate activities, but each of these activities are all invested into what we call common sense, the rhetoric of common sense, the rhetoric of consolidation, the rhetoric of conservative consolidation, and then in the process turn into myth, into a mere element in the second-order semiological system. So you can see how semiology, semiotics, meaning-making, myth-making, code-making, all these come into being in Barthes' Barthes' understanding of culture. So, for example, Barthes used example of a photograph in a Paris match of a Negro soldier saluting the French flag, which has a first and second order connotation, a gesture of loyalty, but also France is a great empire and all its sons without color, discrimination, faithfully serve under the flag. So, Barthes studies iconic images, so how certain images become iconic in quality, certain visual images become important for Barthes. And this particular study of a photograph in Paris match of a black soldier saluting the French flag. And so a black soldier is presumably from Algeria or some French colony, saluting the French flag. It has two degrees of connotation, first and second order. First is a gesture of loyalty. It's a loyalty towards the empire, loyalty towards the French national flag, but also it's an acknowledgement of France being a great empire, the empire that is, demands loyalty from all the sons, irrespective of color, doesn't discriminate between people on the basis of race and color, which obviously is a fantasy. But that fantasy, that grand narrative, is something which is being visually and iconically, articulated in this particular image in the Paris match that Barthes studies. So Barthes' application of a method rooted in linguistics to other systems of discourse outside language, fashion, film, food, etc., opened up completely new possibilities of contemporary cultural studies. So he takes this coded quality, this structural quality, which is rooted in linguistics, because remember he drew on Saussure, the Swiss linguist, but it took that kind of a structural study and applied that into a series of other things, other phenomena outside of language. For instance, fashion. How is fashion structural? How are trends in fashion structural in quality? How is fashion coded in quality? How do mythologies come into being in fashion? How does something become high fashion, something become out of fashion? So these are all mythological decisions, these are all mythological systems which seemingly operate on random logic, but actually they come in the guise of common sense, right? Fashion, film, food. So all these have become very structural activities for Barthes, and all these become very important cultural categories for Barthes. And these structural study, the semiotic study of fashion, film, food, drawing on language, drawing on the coded quality of language and applying that, mapping it onto these broader structures, opened up completely new possibilities for contemporary cultural studies. It was hoped that an invisible seam between language, experience, and reality could be located and prized open through a semiotic analysis of this kind. That a gulf between the alienated intellectual and the real world could be rendered meaningful and miraculously at the same time be made to disappear. So this kind of a study was a very optimistic study, this Roland Barthes way of looking at culture as a semiotic code, as a system of semiotic structures, which was very hopeful, because then that would not discriminate between high culture and low culture at all. It would treat a novel by Balzac with equal importance instead of a wrestling match, because it will look at both activities as a set of codes which are to be decoded through certain semiotic systems. So in that sense, it will be a very universal, democratic way of looking at culture. So that was a very optimistic sort of energy that Barthes brought into cultural studies. It was hoped that the gulf between the alienated intellectual and the real world could be rendered meaningful and miraculously be done away with. Moreover, under Barthes' direction, semiotics promised nothing less than a reconciliation of the two conflicting definitions of culture upon which cultural studies was so ambiguously posited. A marriage of moral conviction, in this case Barthes' Marxist beliefs, and popular themes, the study of a society's total way of life. So, so this dichotomy with which Hebdige opened this particular book, the dichotomy between the Arnoldian way of looking at culture as a way of life, as a certain kind of a conservative aesthetic system which was to be appropriated, and the more socialist way of looking at an anthropological way of looking at culture, that kind of a gulf was supposedly breached, supposedly done away with in Barthes' understanding of culture. So this kind of a coded study of culture, which was offered by Barthes, structuralism, seemed to promise to do away with all kinds of dichotomies in cultural studies. Okay, it was not to say that semiotics was easily assimilable within a cultural studies project. Though Barthes shared the literary preoccupations of Hoggett and Williams, his work introduced a new Marxist problematic, which was alien to the British tradition of concerned and largely untheorized social commentary. As a result, the old debate seemed suddenly limited. In E.P. Thompson's words, it appeared to reflect the parochial concerns of a group of gentlemen amateurs. Thompson sought to replace Williams's definition of the theory of culture as a theory of relations between elements in a whole way of life with his own more rigorously Marxist formulation, the study of relationships in a whole way of conflict. So, this is a more Marxist way of looking at culture. So Thompson brings in the idea of conflict in understanding of culture. He moves away from the Raymond Williams' way of looking at culture as a whole way of life, rather than he's more interested in the confrontations and the conflicts and the tensions and the fault lines which mark culture and cultural activities. A more analytical framework was required. A new vocabulary had to be learned. As part of this process of theorization, the word ideology came to acquire a much wider range of meanings that had previously been the case. We have seen how Barthes found an anonymous ideology. So ideology becomes a very important point in culture studies. So the ideology becomes a very open word. Sometimes a transcendental signifier, sometimes a subversive signifier. It became a very loaded term. So, and then Hebdige says that in Barthes, we found that how he used the term anonymous ideology in terms of looking at cultural activities, the anonymous ideology of common sense, which makes every activity into a grand narrative, which makes every act into a myth, every act of domination into a myth, the myth of domination, the myth of activity, the myth of common sense. All these become invested with an anonymous ideology in Roland Barthes' structural study. So that kind of anonymous ideology penetrated every possible level of social life, inscribed in the most mundane of rituals, framing the most casual, not causal, framing the most casual social encounters. But how can ideology be anonymous? And how can it assume such a broad significance? Before we attempt any reading of subcultural style, we must first define the term ideology more precisely. So this definition is important because we have already spent, as you remember at the beginning of this course, we have spent a considerable amount of time looking at ideology as not just an ideational system, but also as an activity, a consolidating activity, sometimes a subversive activity, but it's an activity, it's an act of thought. But what Hebdige is offering over here is a more complex definition of ideology, which is fundamental in any understanding of culture, and equally, and by extension, fundamental in any understanding of, in any study of culture, true cultural studies. So ideology becomes a very important category, a very important phenomena, a very important term, and a very important code, if you will, if you draw on Barthes, to be understood and examined in any serious study of culture, not least if we engage in cultural studies. So we stop at this point in the lecture today, and we move on in the next lecture to an understanding of ideology as offered by Dick Hebdige. So this concludes this lecture, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.